In a world where survival often demands the unthinkable, Cynthia Okeke stood at the edge of a choice that would either save her mother or shatter her own sense of self. Raised on sacrifice, dignity, and quiet strength, she was never meant to walk a path of desperation. But when love becomes the only reason to breathe, even the strongest hearts are pushed into darkness. This is not just a story of a night. It is the story of what love is willing to endure. Watch this wonderful story to the end to learn a lesson. Always tune in to Adeagle Folktales for more interesting stories. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel. We move. In the quieter outskirts of Abuja, where the roads were uneven and the streetlights flickered more than they shone, lived a girl named Cynthia Okeke, a girl whose life had learned hardship before it ever understood ease. Their home was small, 2 rooms with cracked walls that seemed to hold more memories than comfort. When it rained, water slipped through the roof in thin, stubborn lines, forcing Cynthia to place buckets and bowls around the house. It had become a routine, almost like a silent conversation between her and the leaking ceiling. Yet, for all its flaws, that house was filled with something rare: love. Cynthia's world revolved around one person, her mother, Mama Ngozi. Mama Ngozi was not a woman of many possessions, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Every morning before the sun rose, she would wrap her faded wrapper tightly around her waist, tie her headscarf, and prepare for the market. Her hands were rough from years of labor, but when they touched Cynthia's face, they were always gentle. "Wake up, my daughter," she would say softly. "The world does not wait for those who sleep too long." Cynthia would rise, even when her body begged for more rest, not because she had to, but because she understood. From a young age, she had seen what sacrifice looked like. It looked like her mother skipping meals so she could eat. It looked like worn-out slippers patched again and again instead of replaced. It looked like tired eyes that still found the strength to smile. Cynthia carried all of this with her, quietly, deeply, like something sacred. In school, she was different. While other students complained about assignments, Cynthia embraced them. While others laughed carelessly, she measured her joy, careful not to forget the weight waiting for her at home. Her teachers noticed. "There is something about this girl," her English teacher once said. "She studies like her future depends on it." And it did. Education was not just a path for Cynthia, it was her only way out. Every afternoon, after school, she would go straight to the roadside stall where Mama Ngozi sold vegetables. The stall was nothing more than a wooden table shaded by an unworn umbrella, but it was their lifeline. "Mama, how was sales today?" Cynthia would ask, already tying her wrapper to assist. Mama Ngozi would smile, even on bad days. "We thank God," she would reply. It was their way of surviving disappointment by refusing to give it a voice. Together they worked until evening. Cynthia would arrange tomatoes, call out to customers, and calculate small sums in her head. Then, when darkness began to settle, they would pack up what remained and walk home side by side. Those walks were Cynthia's favorite moments. It was during those quiet journeys that her mother would speak of dreams.
"One day, you will not walk these roads like this," Mama Ngozi would say. "You will ride in cars, work in big offices, and when people see you, they will know that struggle is not the end of a story." Cynthia would smile, though a part of her wondered if such a life was truly meant for someone like her. Still, she believed, because her mother believed. At night, under the dim glow of a lantern, Cynthia studied. Mosquitoes buzzed endlessly, heat clung to her skin, and exhaustion pressed against her eyes, but she did not stop. She couldn't. Failure was not just hers to bear. It would mean her mother's sacrifices were in vain. and that was something she could never allow. But life, as it often does, began to shift in ways she could not control. It started with something small, a cough. Mama Ngozi would turn away slightly, covering her mouth, dismissing it as nothing serious. "It's just the dust from the market," she would say. But the cough lingered. Days turned into weeks, and the cough grew heavier, deeper, like something rooted far within her chest. Soon it was joined by fatigue. Mama Ngozi began to sit more often at the stall, her usual energy slowly draining away. Cynthia noticed everything. She noticed how her mother paused before standing, how she pressed her chest when she thought no one was watching, how her smile came a little slower each day. "Mama, let's go to the hospital," Cynthia urged one evening, her voice tight with concern. Mama Ngozi waved her off gently. "Hospital for what? Do you have money for it?" she asked, not harshly, but with a quiet realism that stung more than anger. Cynthia fell silent. Money. It was always money. Still, the fear growing inside her refused to be silenced. One night, the cough became unbearable. Mama Ngozi struggled to breathe, her body trembling with each painful breath. Cynthia sat beside her, her heart racing, her hands cold. "Mama," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. For the first time, she saw something she had never seen before in her mother's eyes. Fear. That was when Cynthia knew. This was no longer something they could ignore. The next morning, she insisted, firmly this time, and somehow they made their way to a small clinic. The waiting area smelled of antiseptic and worry. Patients sat quietly, each carrying their own unseen battles. Cynthia held her mother's hand tightly, as though letting go would mean losing her. When the doctor finally spoke, his words were careful, but heavy. Tests, treatment, urgency, cost. Each word fell like a stone. Cynthia felt her chest tighten. "How much will it cost?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The figure mentioned did not sound real. It was too large, too impossible, too far beyond anything she could ever hope to gather. She turned to look at her mother. Mama Ngozi sat quietly, her expression calm, but Cynthia could see it, the understanding, the acceptance, and something else, resignation, as though she had already begun to make peace with something Cynthia was not ready to accept. "No," Cynthia whispered under her breath. She refused it. She rejected it completely. Her mother was not going to die, not like this.
Not when she had given everything, not when she was all Cynthia had. That night, Cynthia did not sleep. She sat beside her mother, listening to each breath, counting each rise and fall of her chest, as though it was something fragile that could stop at any moment. Tears rolled silently down her face. "I will not lose you," she whispered into the darkness. It was not a prayer. It was a promise. And somewhere deep within her, something shifted. The girl who had always followed the rules, the girl who believed in doing things the right way, she began to understand something painful. Sometimes, life does not give you the luxury of clean choices. Sometimes, it corners you, and when it does, you either break or you do whatever it takes to survive. Desperation does not arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, through unanswered calls, delayed promises, and the slow realization that help is not coming. For Cynthia, it began the morning after the hospital visit. She woke up with a strange heaviness in her chest, not from sleep, but from the weight of knowing that time was no longer on her side. Her mother lay beside her, breathing softly, but even in sleep, There was discomfort written across her face. Cynthia watched her for a long moment. Then she stood up. If money was what stood between her mother and death, then money was what she would find, no matter how. She began with family. Though they had long drifted apart after her father's death, Cynthia still believed, perhaps foolishly, that blood would remember blood in times of need. Her first call was to her mother's elder sister, Auntie Filma. The phone rang for a long time before it was answered. "Hello?" The voice came, distant and cautious. "Auntie, it's Cynthia." A pause. "Oh, Cynthia, it's been a while." Cynthia swallowed, gripping the phone tightly. "Yes, Ma. Please, Mama is very sick. The doctor said she needs urgent treatment and we don't have the money. I was hoping—" Auntie Filma interrupted, her tone shifting immediately. "My dear, things are not easy for anyone these days." Cynthia's heart sank. But she pressed on. "I understand, Ma, but anything you can give, anything at all." "I wish I could help," her aunt said quickly. "But I have my own children to take care of. School fees, feeding, you know how it is." The call ended with polite words, but no help. Cynthia stared at the phone long after the line went dead. It was not anger she felt. It was something heavier. Disappointment. Still, she did not stop. She called her uncle, Uncle Emeka. He did not pick up. She called again, and again. By the fourth attempt, he switched off his phone. Cynthia sat quietly, her fingers trembling slightly. It was becoming clear. They were avoiding her. Not because they didn't understand, but because they did. Because helping her would require sacrifice. And sacrifice was something people spoke about more easily than they practiced. She moved on to neighbors, people who had smiled at her mother, people who had bought vegetables from their stall for years. Surely someone would care. She knocked on doors, explained, pleaded. Some listened with sympathy, nodding slowly, offering soft words. God will provide. She will be fine. We will pray for her. But prayers did not pay hospital bills. A few gave small amounts, just enough to show they had tried, but not enough to make any real difference. Cynthia accepted everything with gratitude, even the smallest coins.
Because pride had no place in her life anymore. By the third day, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She had walked through streets she barely noticed before. She had stood under the hot sun for hours. She had repeated the same story so many times it began to lose its meaning. My mother is dying. Each time she said it, it felt less like a sentence and more like a reality she could not escape. At the hospital, things grew worse. Mama Ogozi's condition was deteriorating. She spoke less, ate less, moved less, and each time Cynthia visited, the nurses looked at her with the same quiet expectation. Have you brought the money? The question became a kind of torment, because the answer was always the same. No. One afternoon, a nurse pulled her aside. You need to act fast, she said, her voice low but firm. We can only do so much without payment. Cynthia nodded, though her vision blurred with unshed tears. How much time does she have? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. The nurse hesitated. Then she spoke. Not much. The words echoed in Cynthia's mind long after she left the hospital. Not much. How do you measure not much when it is the life of the only person you have? That evening, Cynthia sat outside their house, staring at the dusty road that stretched endlessly before her. Children ran past, laughing. A woman nearby argued over the price of food. Life continued, unbothered, unmoved. Cynthia felt invisible within it, as though her pain existed in a separate world, one that no one else could see or understand. She thought of her school, her dreams, the future she had once imagined. They all felt distant now, irrelevant. What was the use of a future if her mother would not be there to see it? Her chest tightened, and for the first time, fear gave way to something else. Desperation. The kind that strips away comfort. The kind that forces you to look at options you once dismissed. She had tried everything she knew, everything that felt right, and it had not been enough. So what was left? That night, she walked through the city again. Abuja was different at night. The lights were brighter, the people more confident. Cars moved smoothly along clean roads. Laughter spilled from places she could never afford to enter. It was a different world. A world where money flowed easily, where problems like hers could be solved without a second thought. Cynthia stood at the edge of it, watching. And slowly, painfully, a thought began to form. At first, she pushed it away. No, not that. Anything but that. But the thought returned, again and again, until it refused to be ignored. She had heard the stories. Girls who met wealthy men, girls who exchanged a night for money. She had judged them once. She had called it wrong, shameful, unthinkable. But now she understood something she never had before. Hunger changes perspective, pain reshapes judgment, and love, real, consuming love, can push a person beyond the boundaries they once believed were unbreakable. Cynthia hugged herself tightly, as though trying to hold on to the version of her that still believed in clear lines between right and wrong. But those lines were fading. "My mother is dying," she whispered into the night. The words sounded different now, not like a plea, but like a justification, a reason, a permission. Tears slid down her cheeks, unnoticed. If I don't do something, I will lose her. And that was something she could not survive. Not emotionally, not mentally.
Not at all. She closed her eyes, and in that moment she made a decision, not because she wanted to, but because she had run out of choices. The girl who had always walked the straight path was about to step into a world she never imagined for herself, not out of desire, but out of love. And sometimes love demands the kind of sacrifice that leaves scars no one else can see. A decision like Cynthia's does not feel real at first. It sits quietly in the mind, fragile, unreal, almost reversible. But the closer you move toward it, the heavier it becomes, until it is no longer just a thought, but a path you cannot step away from. The morning she decided, Cynthia woke with a strange calm. Not peace, not acceptance, just a stillness that comes when fear has gone too far and turned into resolve. Her mother was weaker that day. Mama Ngozi barely spoke, her voice reduced to a whisper that seemed to fade even as it formed. "Cynthia," she called faintly. Cynthia rushed to her side immediately, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm here, Mama." Her mother studied her face as though searching for something. "You look tired." Cynthia shook her head quickly. "I'm fine." But Mama Ngozi knew her daughter too well. "You have always carried more than you should," she said softly. "Don't let life take your light from you." The words pierced deeper than any accusation ever could. Cynthia looked away. If only her mother knew, if only she understood the kind of choice standing before her now. "I won't," Cynthia whispered, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. That afternoon she made the call. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice low, careful, almost unrecognizable to herself. Every word felt like a step further away from the life she had known. The arrangement was simple: a time, a place, a name. Steve Adeyemi, a man whose world was far removed from hers, a man who could solve her problem in a single moment without even feeling the weight of it. When the call ended, Cynthia sat still for a long time. It was done. There was no going back now. The evening arrived too quickly.
Cynthia stood in front of a small mirror, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the girl looking back at her, not because she looked different, but something inside her had shifted. She wore the simplest dress she owned, nothing extravagant, nothing that tried to impress. She did not know how to be someone else, and she wasn't sure she wanted to try. Her heart pounded as she stepped out into the night. Each step felt heavy, each breath deliberate. By the time she reached the hotel, her palms were damp with sweat. The building stood tall and polished, its glass walls reflecting a world she had never belonged to. People moved in and out with ease, their confidence effortless, their laughter unburdened. Cynthia hesitated at the entrance. For a moment, she almost turned back, but then she saw her mother's face in her mind, weak, fading, waiting. She closed her eyes briefly. "Just one night," she whispered, "for Mama." And then she walked in. The air inside was cool, scented faintly with something expensive and unfamiliar. The floors shone beneath her feet, and the silence felt different, controlled, intentional. A staff member approached her, polite but observant. "Can I help you?" Cynthia nodded, her voice barely steady. "I'm here to see Mr. Steve Adeyemi." There was a brief pause, just enough to measure her, then a nod.
"This way." She followed, her heart racing louder with each step. When she reached the door, she felt it again, that pull, that hesitation. But this time, she didn't stop. The door opened, and there he was, Steve Adeyemi. He was not what she expected, not loud, not imposing, but composed, quietly powerful. His presence filled the room in a way that was not aggressive, but undeniable. His eyes rested on her, not with hunger or impatience, but with curiosity. "You're Cynthia," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied softly. A silence followed, not awkward, but searching. "You look like you don't belong here," he said after a moment. The words caught her off guard. She could have pretended, could have smiled, played a role, said what she thought he wanted to hear, but something in his tone made that impossible. "I don't," she said simply. Steve watched her for a moment longer, and in that moment something shifted, though neither of them fully understood it yet. The night unfolded quietly. There was no glamour in it, no romance, no illusion. For Cynthia, it was something to endure, not something to embrace. She moved through it with a kind of emotional distance, holding on to one thought and one thought alone. "This is for Mama." Every second, every moment, she repeated it like a shield against everything she felt, against the discomfort, against the quiet breaking inside her. She did not cry. Not then, because if she started, she feared she might not stop, and she could not afford to break. Not yet. When it was over, the silence returned, but it felt different now, heavier. Cynthia sat at the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere distant. It was done. The line had been crossed, and there was no undoing it. She stood slowly, gathering herself, not physically, but emotionally. She needed to leave, to return to her mother, to hold on to what remained of her world. But as she reached for her things, Steve spoke. "Wait." His voice was calm, but it carried weight. Cynthia paused. Her heart tightened slightly. She turned to face him. There was no anger in her expression, no expectation, just quiet readiness for whatever came next. Steve studied her carefully, not like a man assessing a transaction, but like someone trying to understand something that did not fit into what he already knew. "Why did you do this?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. Cynthia felt something stir within her. 1,000 possible answers, 1,000 ways to avoid the truth. But she was too tired to lie, too empty to pretend. "My mother is dying," she said softly. The words landed differently this time, not as a plea, not as an explanation, but as a truth stripped of everything else. I had no other way. The room fell silent again, but this silence was not empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something shifting. Steve did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, and for the first time that night, he truly saw her.
Silence has a way of revealing what words often hide. After Cynthia spoke, the room did not rush to fill the space her truth had created. It lingered there, heavy, unembellished, impossible to ignore. Steve Adeyemi did not look away. There was no immediate reply, no rehearsed sympathy, no casual dismissal. He simply stood still, his gaze resting on her as though he were measuring not her words, but the weight behind them. "My mother is dying. I had no other way." The sentence settled between them like something sacred and fragile. Steve exhaled slowly, almost as if releasing something he did not realize he had been holding. "Sit," he said quietly. Cynthia hesitated, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. She had expected the night to end with finality, not continuation. Whatever this was, it was not part of the arrangement she had prepared herself for. Still, she sat. Her hands rested on her lap again, fingers tightly interlocked, as though holding herself together. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. "A while," Cynthia replied, "but it got worse recently." "And the hospital?" "They won't treat her without full payment." Her voice remained steady, but there was something beneath it. Fatigue, perhaps, or the quiet resignation of someone who had repeated the same explanation too many times to too many people who could not help. Steve nodded faintly, absorbing each word. "Have you asked your family?" A small, almost bitter smile touched Cynthia's lips. "Yes." "And?" "They said they couldn't help." There was no anger in her tone, just truth. Steve leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. For a moment he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "What do you study?" The question caught her off guard. "Accounting," she replied after a pause. "You're in school?" "I was," she corrected gently. "I had to stop, for now." "Because of your mother?" Cynthia nodded. Everything in her life had begun to revolve around that one reality. Steve's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but deeper into thought. There was something about her that unsettled him. Not her situation, he had seen worse. Not her decision, he understood the world too well to judge it easily. It was something else. Her honesty, her lack of performance. She was not trying to impress him, not trying to manipulate him. She had simply told the truth and stood in it, and that was rare. "Where is she now?" he asked. "At the clinic," Cynthia answered. "They said if we don't pay soon—" She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Steve understood. He stood up. "I'm coming with you," he said. Cynthia blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What?" "To the hospital." Her breath caught. "You don't have to." "I know," he said calmly, "but I will." There was no grand gesture in his tone, no need for recognition, just a quiet decision. And something about that made it feel real. The drive to the hospital was silent. Cynthia sat beside him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was not how things were supposed to go. He had already fulfilled his part. Anything beyond that was unexpected, unexplainable. When they arrived, the familiar smell of antiseptic greeted her again, but this time something felt different. Perhaps it was the presence beside her, or perhaps it was the fragile thread of hope she had not allowed herself to feel before. They walked in together. The nurses looked up, first at Cynthia, then at Steve.
Something in their expressions shifted immediately. recognition, respect, attention. "Good evening, sir," one of them said quickly. Steve nodded slightly. "I'd like to see the doctor in charge of Mrs. Ngozi Okeke." Within minutes, they were ushered into an office Cynthia had sat outside for hours without acknowledgement. The doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stood up as they entered. "Mr. Adeyemi," he greeted, surprise evident in his voice. Steve gestured lightly toward Cynthia. "She's with me. I understand her mother needs urgent treatment." The doctor nodded, glancing at Cynthia briefly. "Yes, the condition is quite serious. We've been waiting for—" "Send me the full bill," Steve interrupted calmly. The doctor paused. "All of it," Steve added. There was a brief silence, then understanding. "Of course," the doctor said quickly. Cynthia stood there, unmoving. Her ears heard the words, but her mind struggled to process them. All of it. Not part. Not a portion. Everything. "Also," Steve continued, "ensure she gets the best care available." "Yes, sir." Just like that, the barrier that had stood before her for days, unmovable, unforgiving, began to crumble. Cynthia's vision blurred. She turned slightly, her chest tightening as emotion rose suddenly, uncontrollably. She tried to hold it in, tried to remain composed, but it was too much. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort. Steve looked at her, not with pride, not with expectation, but with something gentler. "You don't have to thank me yet," he said. "Let's make sure she gets better first." When Cynthia entered her mother's room, her steps were slower, almost cautious, as though she were afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. Mama Ngozi lay where she had left her, weak, still, but breathing. Cynthia approached the bed and took her hand gently. "Mama?" Her mother's eyes opened slowly. "Cynthia," she murmured, "I'm here." There was so much she wanted to say, so much she wanted to explain, but the words tangled within her. Instead, she smiled, softly, tearfully. "You're going to be okay," she said. For the first time in days, she believed it. The days that followed felt almost unreal. Treatment began immediately. Medications, tests, care. Everything that had once been delayed by money now moved forward without hesitation. Cynthia remained by her mother's side, watching each small improvement like it was a miracle. And perhaps it was. Steve did not disappear. He returned, not constantly, not intrusively, but enough. Enough to check, enough to ensure things were progressing. One afternoon, Cynthia found the courage to ask, "Why are you doing all this for me?" Steve paused, considering the question. Then he answered simply, "Because you didn't lie." Cynthia frowned slightly, confused. "I've heard every story, every excuse, every performance." He looked at her directly.
"But you told the truth, even when it didn't make you look good." Cynthia lowered her gaze. "I didn't have the strength to pretend," she said quietly. Steve nodded. "And that's exactly why I believe you deserve a chance." But he did not stop there. Once her mother stabilized, Steve made another decision. "I have a position in my company," he told her one evening. "It's not charity. You'll work for it." Cynthia looked up, startled. I don't know what to say." "Say yes or no," he replied calmly. Tears filled her eyes again. "Yes." And just like that, another door opened. Not through luck, not through deception, but through something far rarer. Being seen, truly seen, for who she was beneath everything life had forced her to become. Change rarely arrives quietly. It does not slip into life unnoticed. It announces itself in small shifts that others begin to observe long before they understand. For Cynthia, it began with absence. She was no longer at the roadside stall, no longer seen walking long distances under the sun, no longer the girl whose life seemed permanently tied to struggle. At first, people assumed the worst. "Maybe the mother has died," one neighbor whispered. "Or maybe she ran away," another suggested. But then she returned. Not the same, and not unnoticed. Cynthia stepped out of a modest car one afternoon, dressed simply but neatly, her posture carrying a quiet confidence that had not been there before. It was not pride, it was stability, the kind that comes when fear no longer controls every decision. She had moved into a new home, nothing extravagant, but solid, comfortable, and peaceful. A place where rain no longer leaked through the roof, a place where her mother could rest without discomfort. Mamangazi was recovering, slowly, but visibly. Strength had begun to return to her voice. Color had returned to her face. And though she still needed care, she was no longer fading. For Cynthia, that alone was everything. But the world outside their home told a different story. Whispers began. At first they were soft, curious, uncertain. How did she do it? Where did the money come from? Then they grew louder. "She has a rich sponsor. I heard she's involved with big men." Girls like that, you never really know. The same people who had once turned her away now watched her with sharp interest. Their eyes followed her movements. Their voices carried judgment wrapped in speculation. Cynthia heard it all. Every word, every insinuation, and each time it pressed against her, but did not break her. Because she knew something they did not, the truth. At her new workplace, things were different. Steve Idiemi had kept his word. The job was real, demanding, structured. Cynthia worked as an assistant in the finance department, far from glamorous, but exactly where her skills belonged. At first, she struggled, not with the work, but with the environment. People spoke differently, carried themselves differently. There was an ease she had not yet learned. Some colleagues welcomed her politely, others watched her with quiet skepticism. "She came out of nowhere," one whispered. "Connections," another replied knowingly. Cynthia did not respond. She arrived early, left late, worked harder than anyone expected, because she understood something deeply. Opportunity, when given, must be protected, and the only way she knew how to protect it was through effort. Over time, things began to shift. Respect replaced doubt. Not completely, but enough.
At home, the transformation was gentler. One evening, Cynthia sat beside her mother, adjusting her pillow carefully. "Are you comfortable, Mama?" Mamangozi smiled softly, more than I have been in a long time. There was a pause. Then her mother reached for her hand. "You have done something for me that I can never repay," she said. Cynthia shook her head quickly. "No, Mama, don't say that." "I must," Mamangozi insisted gently, "because I know this was not easy for you." Cynthia's chest tightened. Her mother did not know everything, but she knew enough. "Mama, you chose me," her mother continued. "Even when life gave you a choice that could have taken something from you." Tears filled Cynthia's eyes. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing you." Mamangozi squeezed her hand. "And yet, you didn't lose yourself." Those words settled deeply. Because for days, weeks, Cynthia had questioned that. Had wondered if she had crossed a line she could never return from. But hearing her mother say that, it gave her something she had been searching for. Peace. Still, the world outside remained restless. The rumors did not disappear. They changed shape. Some softened, others sharpened.
But they never fully stopped, until the day everything shifted. It happened at a company event, a formal gathering, one Cynthia had not expected to attend. "You'll be there," Steve told her simply. "I don't think I belong in that kind of setting," she replied honestly. "You do," he said. "You just don't know it yet." That evening, Cynthia stood among people who once felt far removed from her reality. The room was filled with elegance, conversation, quiet power. And for a moment, she felt small again. But then, "Cynthia!" She turned. Steve stood beside her, not as the man who had helped her, not as someone above her, but as someone acknowledging her presence. "Come," he said. He introduced her, not as a secret, not as a favor, but as part of his team. "This is Cynthia Okeke," he said, "one of the most dedicated people in my company." There was no embellishment, no explanation, just truth. And in that moment, something changed, not just in the room, but beyond it. Because people were watching, listening, understanding. The narrative they had built began to crack, not completely, but enough. Back in her old neighborhood, the whispers shifted once more. "That's the girl working with Steve Ediemi. She's not what we thought. Maybe we judged too quickly." Some spoke with regret, others with quiet envy. But none of it held the same power anymore, because Cynthia had moved beyond needing their approval. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm gold, Cynthia sat outside her new home with her mother. The air was calm, still, peaceful. "Mama," she said softly, "was it worth it?" Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. "My daughter, love is not measured by what it costs." She paused, her eyes gentle but firm, "but by what it is willing to give." Cynthia leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear, no urgency, no desperation. Just quiet, just presence, just life. And somewhere within that stillness, a truth settled fully in her heart. The world would always talk. It would always question, judge, and misunderstand. But those who have walked through fire do not need the world to explain their story, because they have lived it and survived it. And in the end, that is more than enough. Life does not always offer clean paths or easy choices. Sometimes the heart is forced into decisions that the world will judge without understanding. But true character is not defined by a single moment. It is revealed in intention, sacrifice, and the courage to endure consequences for the sake of love. When choices are made from a place of selflessness, they carry a quiet truth the world may never fully see. Compassion must always come before judgment, for we rarely know the battles others fight. And so, while the city continued its endless rhythm of noise, gossip, and fleeting opinions, Cynthia's life moved forward in quiet strength. She did not chase validation, nor did she explain her story to those who had already decided who she was. Beside her, her mother breathed, alive, present, and healing. And that was enough. Because in the end, the loudest victories are not the ones the world applauds, but the ones the heart survives in silence, holding on to love when everything else falls away. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story. Do well to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Adigo Folktales channel.